My special guest today is the Department of Politics at the University of Liverpool. He recently published a book entitled The End of China's Non-Intervention Policy in Africa. This book was published by the Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. Dr. Obert, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this great show.
How is Liverpool? How is the University of Liverpool? How is Liverpool the city and Liverpool the team?
Liverpool, the team, not doing well. We hope it's just a passing phase. Mm-hmm. But Liverpool it's a great city, a great university as well, with a very long, complex history. And there has been a lot of talk. I think it has been in the news sometime in the context of decolonization, Black Lives Matter. Names of some buildings had to be changed. But that speaks about the complexity of the world we're living in today. Mm-hmm. And Liverpool, to some extent, shows in some way those complexities. But it's a great place. I've been at the University of Liverpool this is my second year now. I couldn't be in any other place. We have a great department which is expanding, and a whole range of quite good students as well. So it's a great place to be.
And I hope the team does well as time goes on. It's good news for us Chelsea fans.
I'm a United fan.
How does that happen, that somebody who stays in Liverpool, works at Liverpool, supports another team?
It's difficult. My neighbors, they all support Liverpool. They have Liverpool flags in their yards.
Oh my God.
It's not an easy thing. So it's one of those things that you have to hide.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I'm happy to have you, Dr. Obert Hodzi, and specifically to discuss your book, The End of China's Non-Intervention Policy in Africa. Can you just take us through the core ideas of your book and what you consider to be the book's central argument?
It's a very provocative title, The End of China's Non-Intervention Policy, because China officially says that it doesn't intervene or interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, particularly African countries. And African countries are quite sensitive to interference by external powers. And my book looks at that. What is intervention? How does China understand intervention? Because what I notice is that in most cases, we impose definitions of concepts on the non-Western world. And we take intervention, we take democracy, for instance, to mean what it means in China as exactly what it means in the US or in the UK or in the Western world. But China has different understandings of what intervention is. And what I try to do is to look at how China understands intervention, how it defines intervention, and then try to see if that has been changing in its behavior. So I looked at, for instance, when China says it doesn't intervene, it basically means that it doesn't interact with with opposition leaders, for instance. So in some cases, what I did is to look at, has China ever interfered or engaged opposition parties in African countries? Has China tried to persuade or to use its diplomatic power or economic power to force parties, for instance, in South Sudan who were fighting, to change their fighting methods, to change how they're fighting, where they are fighting, and then to look at it and say, by China's definition, it is not supposed to be engaging rebel movements. But here is a case where China is engaging rebel movements. And therefore, from China's own definition of non-intervention, it is actually intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. The second thing that that the book tries to do is to debunk this idea that relations between China and Africa have been consistent. The all-weather friend kind of relationships, things that we hear every time. And to see that across, from the 1950s up to 2021, relations haven't been really good. In the 1960s, for example, countries like Kenya, Ghana, cut diplomatic relations with China because they argue that China was supporting dissidents who were trying to topple newly independent
leaders, yeah.
governments. So we see that China's relations with African countries have not always been as rosy as they are officially portrayed to be. So the third thing that the book looks at is to look at how China is changing its behavior. Mm-hmm. Or how it is intervening, because it's intervening in a different way. So the US would use its military power to intervene in other countries, but China doesn't use its military power to intervene. It uses institutions that it has control over, where it has influence over, and what it has been doing is to change from opposing, vetoing any action by the United Nations that it interprets as intervention or interference in the internal affairs of other states, to actually start supporting such resolutions in the United. And that's a big shift for China by its own standards. And so what I do then is to look at different cases, Libya, Mali, South Sudan, and track how China has responded to conflicts in those three countries, and to see if there are any patterns and trends in its intervention behavior. So in a nutshell, this is what the book looks at. What I can add is the thinking behind this was to some extent influenced by my research by my research in Hong Kong, where I realized that when I came to Hong Kong, I had these ideas. I grew up in Zimbabwe. I did my education in Zimbabwe. I also studied in Germany. So I went with a Western mind and thought that things are, it's universal. The Western understandings of certain concepts are universal. But in China, in Hong Kong, I realized that they are not, right? There are so many things that we take for granted based on our Western education or the Western experience that we have had. And that blurs our thinking and our way of analyzing international politics. And so I think that if we need to understand China, if we need to understand Africa, we have to take a step back and try to see things from their own perspectives. And I think that's the contribution the book makes and the change that it is trying to perhaps bring across.
I actually saw that on your CV, it says that you received your PhD in Hong Kong.
Yes.
You did some field work and you did some interviews with a group of people to inquire about this particular topic. Would you just share with me what you got from these interviews and possibly the kind of people that you conducted, or the kind of people that you sat down with to ask and inquire about this?
So, like I said, it's a very political and very sensitive topic to discuss. Yeah. So it also means that I had limited people that I could talk about that research in Hong Kong and in mainland China. But I visited mainland China. I spent maybe 2 months there and talking to academics mostly, how they understand China, these concepts like non-intervention. Unfortunately, I couldn't talk to officials, like government officials in China. It was extremely difficult to be able to do that. But the Chinese academics at Chinese universities and academies that I talked to some extent have been cited a lot in international media. And what I got from it is that these are people who have to some extent are on the approved list of academics who can give interviews. And so to some extent, they are I don't want to call them pseudo spokespersons of the government, but something like that. They, to some extent, communicate the position of the government in most of these things. So I think I kind of like got a good insight into how they understand intervention, how they understand, how they see China's relations with African countries in the context of politics and security. I also spent 3 months in Ethiopia. I wanted to do more of my interviews at the African Union because I thought it was the best place to get all the instead of visiting Sudan, instead of going to Libya, these are conflict areas, it was going to be difficult. But the African Union provided me with an opportunity to talk to representatives of those countries in a fairly safer place. And so I had quite a number of interviews at the African Union. But one thing that I want to point out is the difficulties that, let me say, Black people face to have an interview. You have to come from a good institution for someone to even respond to your email.
Yeah.
You know, and it didn't help much because my institution is not well known, right? It's a liberal arts university and possibly the smallest in Hong Kong. So it doesn't carry the prestige that if you send an email to someone, they would say, oh my God, I need to open this. This is from Harvard. This is from Cambridge. This is from Oxford, right? And so there are those challenges. And my stay in China was quite difficult because when I go there, people didn't expect to see a person like me. And to some extent, it reflected in the kind of discussions we had and the kind of access, the hoops that I had to jump to be able to get access. The African Union wasn't even any better, right? And you would think that as an African, you'd get easier access, but it's actually not the same thing.
Preferential treatment.
Yeah, there was no preferential treatment. It was difficult to get people. You have to get some support from big names to be able to get those interviews. And I think that's a big challenge that most African academics face. And it's even worse for academics who are based in African countries. They face a lot of challenges to get interviews. People just don't take them seriously, or people think they don't know what they're doing, things like that. So it makes it very difficult for Africans to do research.
It's been argued by others that China is the new colonizer. From the studies that you have done, do you think that Chinese investments are a form of a new colonialism? Do these investments equally benefit governments in Africa as well as the citizens?
The argument that China is colonizing Africa is an argument that came from mostly the Western world, the Western media, and also given momentum by leaders like Hillary Clinton, for instance, who talk about those things. But I think the objective was to make Africans question their relationship with China. Not from a position that they are looking out for African interests, but because the Western world realized, particularly European powers, France, Britain, and the US, realized that they were losing a lot of influence in Africa. In many countries, African countries were looking towards China. And so Europe, the US, they don't have as much leverage as they had and to influence things in African countries. Because I'll give an example of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe started talking about locust policy as a way of getting rid of sanctions, reducing the impact of sanctions that had been imposed on it. And for the past 20 years, Zimbabwe has been on sanctions, but it has basically been sustained because of its relationship with China. Chinese investments, Chinese development assistance, Chinese donations, things like that. Things that Zimbabwe would not otherwise have been able to get. And that's power that the US has lost, that the EU has lost. You know, the sanctions don't have as much sting as they would have had if China was not there. So from that perspective, that strategic loss, that loss of strategic influence, it made sense for them to invoke these ideas of China is colonizing Africa. I think China is not colonizing Africa for several reasons. The first thing is that how Chinese operate, how Chinese investments come to African countries is in most cases by invitation. of African leaders. Even the development assistance, most of the things that we talk about, buildings that are being constructed by the Chinese, they are not coming out of the initiative of the Chinese, but it's African leaders who go to China and request for those things.
For those, yeah.
You know, so we can say maybe it's colonization by invitation, but I would hesitate to use the word colonization. Is Africa getting a good deal? I think no, they are not getting a good deal. A few countries are getting good deals from China, but the majority of African countries are not getting good deals. They're not getting good deals because very many African countries are small. The size, if we look at the biggest economies, well, Nigeria says it's the biggest economy, but I would want to consider South Africa because of the diversity and the well-developed infrastructure that it has, how diversified and mature its economy is. South Africa is the size of Guangdong, a Chinese province, right? And what bargaining power does China with a GDP of about 300 billion have with China, which is almost like 11 or so trillion?
Yeah.
These are unequal relations. There is no way that South Africa can negotiate a good deal with China because of the differences in their size.
Yeah.
And then if you put Zimbabwe in that context with a GDP of 15 billion, our bargaining power is very small.
Yeah.
So we will not get good deals. We will not benefit equally from what China is doing. Instead, what we get is what China cannot get. You know, is perhaps businesses that are not able to invest elsewhere, right? And then Zimbabwe becomes an easy option. And then if you want to look at it from a continental perspective, only 4% of Chinese, so, you know, Africa only contributes about 4% in China's economy, right, of its global trade. So if only 4% is coming from Africa, then a single African country cannot even think of a good deal with China. They are not going to be able to get a good deal with China. The only hope would have been if African countries would learn to bring their bargaining power together, for the AU to lead, maybe to have a China strategy, because there's no China strategy in Africa. So African countries go to China, or they have these FOCAC meetings where China gathers all these leaders and communicates its strategy and its positions and what it wants to do with African countries and in Africa. But we don't have African countries calling China, the AU calling China to say, or the external partners, you know, to say, this is what we want and this is how we're going to deal with you. Instead, we have all these African leaders being called to Turkey for Turkey Africa Summit, being called to China for China Africa Summit, being called to the US for US Africa Summit. But why can't Africa call all these external partners to communicate what they want? They are not able to do that because they can't harness their power. So we can talk about African Union, we can talk about African unity, we can talk about African Renaissance, but as long as African countries continue to act on their own and individually, then it's not going to work. And to some extent, China supports it doesn't support the integration of African countries. It prefers to deal with countries one by one. Because then it has more leverage.
Leverage,
right?
exactly.
And African countries support it to some extent, support it in that. So way, African leaders, I think, are letting the continent down in choosing to deal with with China individually. And the African Union is definitely letting the whole continent down by not having a China strategy. I think we should have a China strategy.
Can Chinese and United States interests coexist on the African continent, given the global dominance that the United States has enjoyed in history?
As it is right now, I think they will not be able to coexist in Africa. They have different interests. They prioritize different things. The US would prioritize, for instance, democracy, good governance, strategic military relations with Egypt, Ethiopia, maybe Uganda. So China deals with any regime regardless of its record, human rights record, good governance record, human rights record. It doesn't really care so much about those things. So they're bound to step on each other's toes, and they have done that on several occasions. I was just, going through my Twitter, and I saw that the China imposed sanctions on a few EU individuals and entities. And that shows how tense relations are, right? But I think African countries can make these two coexist if we exercise our agents. I'll continue going back to place the responsibility on African leaders and on African countries. If we are able to be deliberate in how we deal with these two powers, we can extract benefits from both of them without being reduced to passive actors in this geopolitical conflict between two powers. How we can do that is first of all to see what can the US contribute to Africa's development, and what can China contribute to Africa's development, and who best serves our interest in situation A or situation B. Mm-hmm. Right now, I think what Africa needs the most is infrastructure development. I was checking some statistics. Few sub-Saharan African countries have their citizens, more than half their citizens, with access to electricity. Mm-hmm. Some countries have as low as 13% access to electricity. Mm-hmm. And who is best placed to help us to build the infrastructure we need for electricity? China is able to do that, right? And then if we look at political instability in African countries, if we look at gross human rights violations, who is best able to help us to make things better? The US is able to help us more than China is able to help us. Mm. And to be able to, to look at what we need and who is best able to do that. I think that's something that African countries need. I used to work for donor organizations, for a donor organization in Zimbabwe. And donors sit and they decide on what they want to focus on and actually say which donor is best able to do A, B, C, and D in Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. And if the donor can sit and discuss and say, this is what we want to do in Zimbabwe, and A can fund this, B can fund that, I think African countries, we can do that. Mm-hmm. We have the commodities, primary commodities that most countries want. Mm-hmm. And we should be able to use those comparative advantages that we have. But we cannot do that if we leave it only to Zimbabwe or to Rwanda to be able to do that. Yeah, I think Kagame has been talking greatly about this need to be able to dictate to donors and to our external partners what we want them to do, what our priority areas are. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, I think the biggest challenge is that even though the AU has Agenda 2063, Agenda 2063 is not going to work because African leaders, African countries don't contribute much.
Exactly.
So 75% of the AU's budget come from external partners. Mm-hmm. And the EU gives a chunk of that 75%. Mm-hmm. And so what it basically shows is unless we put our house in order, we'll continue to be pawn on the chessboard of these big powers.
Yeah,
they'll continue tossing us to each other.
It increases our vulnerability.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So that's the biggest challenge we have. Mm-hmm. No country is going to come and invest in Africa because they just love us. Mm-hmm. right? The same way that no Africans will come and invest in Europe because they just love it.
Exactly.
You know,
It has
every
to be for a
country is
reason.
looking out for their strategic interest.
Exactly.
And for African countries, what is our strategic interest as a country? Zimbabwe, Malawi, Ghana, or whatever country it is. And as a continent, what is it that we want? Part of my frustration is we talk big, and then after talking big, we go to the EU summits, we go to the China Africa summits, and with a begging bowl, it's not going to work. They will not take us seriously. Perhaps the Continental Free Trade Agreement could be the best way to go. And I think Ghana and some countries that produce cocoa have been talking about not sending cocoa outside unless they have added value to it. So those are small steps, but I think it's something that needs to be built on if Africa has to get a good deal from China, from the US, from Turkey, from any other power that wants to do business in Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obert Hodzi. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Obert Hodzi. His book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste on the description panel on the upload for this video and in the comment section right on our Facebook page. The title of this book is The End of China's Non-Intervention Policy in Africa and can be accessed on the website of the Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I had a great time.
That is
Thank
wonderful.
you very much.
That is wonderful. Have a good day.